the warm glow of chandeliers reflected off the polished marble floors as laughter and conversation filled the grand dining hall. Emma clutched her wineglass, swirling the deep red liquid absent-mindedly, while her husband engaged in yet another dull conversation about quarterly earnings. She had been to enough of these corporate events to know her role, smile, nod, and look presentable. But tonight something felt different. A lingering gaze burned into her, sending a strange thrill through her spine. Richard, the man of the hour, stood across the room, exuding effortless confidence. Everything about him commanded attention, the way he carried himself, the sharp cut of his tailored suit, the slight smirk that hinted he always got what he wanted. When their eyes met, he held her gaze longer than necessary. Emma quickly looked away, a flush creeping up her neck. Moments later, she felt his presence beside her before she even saw him. "You look like you need a more interesting conversation," Richard said smoothly, his voice rich with amusement. Emma turned, surprised by his forwardness. She let out a small laugh, glancing at her husband, who was still deep in conversation, oblivious to her growing boredom. "That obvious, huh?" Richard smiled, his eyes flicking over her with slow appraisal. "A woman like you shouldn't be left in the background." The way he said it, with such deliberate charm, made her stomach flutter. It had been a long time since someone looked at her like that. The conversation flowed easily. He asked about her interests, her thoughts, and even her frustrations, things her husband had stopped asking long ago. His attention was intoxicating, making her feel important, seen. Every word he spoke, every subtle brush of his hand as they stood close, created an electric tension neither acknowledged but both felt. After dinner, while most of the guests were still mingling, Richard leaned in, his lips inches from her ear. "Come to my office sometime," he murmured, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "I'd love to get to know you better, outside of these dull events." Emma froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The invitation was clear, laced with a promise that sent her mind spinning. It wasn't just polite small talk. It wasn't just a casual gesture. He was offering something far more dangerous. She swallowed, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed the quiet exchange. Her husband was still engrossed in work discussions, oblivious to the silent war raging inside her. She should say no. She should laugh it off. But the way Richard looked at her made her hesitate. "Think about it," he said, giving her a knowing smile before stepping away, seamlessly blending back into the crowd as if he hadn't just flipped her world upside down. Emma stood frozen, the invitation lingering in the air, heavy and full of temptation. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the message on her phone. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of an unspoken promise. "Lunch tomorrow, just us." Her fingers hovered over the screen. The logical response was to delete it, ignore it, pretend it had never arrived. But she didn't. Instead, she read it again and again. The temptation it carried was undeniable. Since the dinner party, Richard had invaded her thoughts in ways she hadn't expected. The way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, it was different. It made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Desired. Seen. Alive. She turned her head slightly, glancing at her husband, who was seated at his desk, his eyes locked on his laptop screen. His fingers typed quickly, his focus entirely on work. It had been like this for months, maybe even years. Their conversations were now limited to schedules, bills, and polite exchanges over dinner. The intimacy, the laughter, the connection, they had faded into the background of their marriage, replaced by routine and obligation. He didn't notice how distant she had become, how she barely reached for him anymore. If he did, he never said anything. He never asked. Emma sighed and locked her phone, pressing it against her palm as if that could suppress the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Guilt crept in, whispering reminders of vows made and a life built together. This wasn't just a harmless invitation, it was a step towards something dangerous, something irreversible. But another voice, the one she was trying so hard to silence, kept reminding her how effortless it felt to talk to Richard, how he had listened to her, looked at her with genuine interest, given her attention she hadn't realized she was craving. He made her feel beautiful, exciting, like more than just a wife lost in the shadow of her husband's career. Her phone vibrated again, pulling her back into the moment. Another message. No pressure, just a conversation. Her heart pounded as she read it. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding anything. He was offering her a choice. She glanced at her husband one last time, hoping, just for a moment, that he would turn around, that he would sense something was wrong, that he would look at her the way Richard had. But he didn't. His focus remained on the screen, on the work that had long taken priority over their relationship. Emma exhaled slowly, her decision already forming before she even acknowledged it. Her fingers moved against the screen, typing out a single word. Okay. As soon as she pressed send, a shiver ran through her. She knew she had just crossed a line, one she could never uncross. Emma stepped out of the elevator, her heart pounding in rhythm with her heels against the plush, carpeted floor. The dimly lit hallway stretched ahead, leading to a door she already knew she shouldn't be walking toward. Every step was a battle between restraint and reckless desire, between the woman she had been and the one she was allowing herself to become. Room 803. The number stared back at her as she stood outside, fingers trembling as she raised her hand to knock. The door opened before she could. Richard stood there, his presence filling the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes dark with something unmistakable. "You came," he murmured, stepping aside to let her in. Emma swallowed hard, stepping past him, the scent of expensive cologne and temptation wrapping around her. The room was elegant, understated luxury in every detail. The dim lighting, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the crisp white sheets on the bed that seemed to taunt her. She turned to face him, searching for hesitation, for some sign that he would tell her to leave, to stop this before it started. But there was none. Only confidence, only certainty. Richard had known the moment she answered his message that she had already made her choice. "I thought about cancelling," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you didn't," Richard said, stepping closer, his fingers trailing along the side of her arm, a slow, deliberate touch that sent a shiver down her spine. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but neither of them needed them. His hands found her waist, pulling her close, and before she could find another excuse, his lips were on hers. The hesitation, the guilt, the logical part of her mind all faded the second their bodies pressed together. Richard kissed her with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, knew exactly how to make her forget everything outside this room. His touch was slow, deliberate, teasing her into surrender. Emma melted into him, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body aching for more. Everything blurred, the sound of the city outside, the distant hum of the air conditioning, even the thoughts of her husband waiting for her at home. Here, in this moment, there was only Richard. Hours later, as she lay tangled in the sheets beside him, the weight of reality began to sink in. The rush, the thrill, it had been intoxicating, but now in the aftermath guilt began to creep into the corners of her mind. She turned her head, watching Richard as he lay beside her, completely unbothered, his fingers lazily tracing circles on her bare skin. Emma swallowed hard, her breath shaky. She had done it. She had crossed the line. And no matter how she tried to justify it, no matter how much she had wanted to feel desired again, she couldn't escape the truth. There was no going back. Emma stepped into the house, closing the door behind her as quietly as possible. The darkness in the living room was comforting, wrapping around her like a cloak, hiding her from the shame that was already settling deep in her bones. She could hear the faint sound of the television in the background, signalling that her husband was still awake. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself forward, walking toward the familiar presence of the man she had promised forever to. He was sitting on the couch, his laptop open on the coffee table, glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His focus was entirely on the screen, his fingers scrolling through work emails, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than usual. He glanced up, giving her a small smile before turning his attention back to the screen. "Hey, you're home late. The event ran long?" She nodded quickly, grateful for the easy excuse. "Yeah, just a lot of talking. You know how those things go." The lie slid from her lips effortlessly, but it burned inside her. He stretched, rubbing the back of his neck. "You must be exhausted. Come sit with me for a bit." Emma hesitated, sitting next to him, feeling his warmth, his trust. It was too much. Her body still carried the imprint of another man's touch, and she couldn't bear to let her husband's hands reach for her now. "I think I'll just head to bed," she said quickly, her voice tight. It was a long night. He looked at her, really looked at her this time, as if sensing something off in her tone. His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't press. "All right, I'll be up soon." Emma turned before he could see the emotion building in her eyes. She made her way to the bedroom, closing the door behind her, pressing her forehead against the cool wood. Her breath came in uneven gasps, the weight of her betrayal crashing down in waves. She thought she would feel satisfied, that Richard would have filled the void inside her, but instead she felt hollow, empty in a way she never had before. The worst part was knowing she would have to see him again. Richard wasn't just some stranger she could erase from her life. He was her husband's boss. He would be at every company dinner, every office event, every celebration, and worst of all, he knew what they had done. At every meeting, every passing glance, he would look at her with that knowing smirk, that quiet amusement in his eyes, reminding her of the moment she had crossed the line. He wasn't burdened by guilt the way she was. He wasn't suffering through the weight of lies every time he looked at her husband. Emma curled up in bed, pulling the covers tightly around her, as if she could bury the shame deep enough to make it disappear. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself that this was just a mistake she wouldn't repeat, she knew the truth. Richard wasn't finished with her, and deep down, the most terrifying realization of all, neither was she. Emma sat at the office dinner, her hands resting in her lap, fingers gripping the hem of her dress as though grounding herself. Across the table, Richard was speaking with a group of executives, his voice smooth, his laughter perfectly timed. No one at the table would suspect that hours ago his lips had been pressed against her skin, his hands tracing the very same dress she now wore. The secret between them felt suffocating. Every time he glanced at her, every slight smirk that played at his lips, she felt the weight of his control tightening around her like an invisible leash. Richard was a man who thrived on power, and now he had something more than just professional authority. He had her. Their meetings had not stopped after that first night. What had begun as a single act of weakness had spiraled into something darker, something she couldn't seem to pull herself away from. The secrecy, the stolen moments, the thrill of knowing they could be caught. It had only intensified the attraction. Each time she told herself it would be the last. each time she had proven herself a liar. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down, her breath catching. "Richard, meet me outside in 10 minutes. A chill ran through her. He didn't ask, he demanded. And the worst part was, she knew she would go. Excusing herself from the table, she moved through the crowded restaurant, feeling her heart pound with every step. The farther she got from her husband, the heavier the guilt settled in her chest. Yet it was drowned out by the anticipation curling low in her stomach. She found Richard waiting near the back exit, leaning casually against the wall, exuding the same confidence that had drawn her in from the beginning. "You didn't take long," he murmured, stepping closer, his fingers brushing along her arm. "This is dangerous," she whispered, glancing around. The risk was growing. The lies were piling up. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer. "That's what makes it exciting, isn't it?" His lips barely grazed her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, knowing she should push him away, knowing this was going too far. But she didn't. Each time she told herself she could stop, that she could end it before it went too far. But it had already gone too far. The paranoia had begun creeping into her daily life. Every time her husband looked at her for too long, she wondered if he suspected something. Every time he asked where she had been, she over-explained, afraid that a simple answer wouldn't be enough. Her mind was consumed by fear, by the thought that one mistake, one misplaced text, one suspicious glance would bring everything crashing down. But even as the fear suffocated her, the addiction to Richard pulled her deeper. And she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. Emma felt the shift in her husband's demeanour before he even spoke a word. It had started subtly, his glances lasting a second too long, the way his voice carried a sharpness it never had before. He hadn't confronted her yet, but she could feel it building, an unspoken tension pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. At dinner he barely ate, his fork moving absently over his plate. His usual questions about her day were absent, replaced by silence that felt heavier than any accusation. She forced herself to eat, each bite tasteless as she tried to ignore the way he studied her. "You've been different lately," he finally said, his voice calm but deliberate. Emma's stomach tightened. She lifted her glass to her lips, forcing herself to keep steady. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. "I don't know. Maybe it's the way you've been working late so often, or the way your phone never seems to leave your side anymore." His eyes were unreadable, but she saw the suspicion, the quiet challenge behind them. A lump formed in her throat. She had been careful, hadn't she? No calls or messages when he was around, no missed dinners without an excuse. But the paranoia that had been creeping into her mind was now staring her in the face, sitting across from her in the form of the man she had betrayed. "I've just been busy," she lied, forcing a soft smile. "You know how projects pile up." Her husband exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. "Right." His tone was clipped, disbelieving. He didn't push further, but the silence that followed was suffocating. That night, Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding. She had convinced herself that she was in control of this affair, that no one would ever find out. But now, doubt gnawed at her. Had she slipped up? Had Richard? The answer came the next evening. Emma stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around herself as she reached for her phone. The screen lit up with a new message. "Richard. Miss me. I've been thinking about that last time." Before she could process the panic seizing her chest, her husband's voice cut through the air. "You should really be more careful." Her entire body went cold. She turned slowly, dread sinking into her bones as she saw him standing in the doorway, holding her phone in his hand. His face was eerily calm, but his eyes burned with betrayal. Her heart pounded as she took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "I can explain." He let out a bitter laugh. "Can you?" His grip tightened on the phone. "Because I think this message explains plenty." The air between them was thick, suffocating. The truth was out. The moment she had been dreading had arrived, and there was no escaping the fallout. Emma sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears that refused to stop. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of a door slamming shut as her husband moved around, packing his things. The weight of her mistake pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. He hadn't spoken much since reading the message. His rage had burned fast, giving way to something colder. Disappointment, heartbreak, the realization that the woman he trusted had shattered everything they had built together. "You didn't even try to lie," he finally said, his voice hollow as he placed his suitcase near the door. "I guess that's something." Emma flinched at his words, knowing they were deserved. "I didn't want to make it worse," she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. A bitter chuckle escaped him. "Worse?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You've been lying for weeks, maybe months. I don't even know who you are anymore." She had no defense, no excuses that could undo the damage. All she could do was watch as the man who had once looked at her with nothing but love now looked at her like a stranger. Richard's name had not been spoken, but it hung in the air between them like a ghost. Emma thought about him, about how easy it had been for him to walk away unscathed. To him, this had been nothing more than a game, a pursuit, a challenge he had conquered before moving on. He would sleep just fine tonight while she sat drowning in the ruins of her marriage. Her husband grabbed his keys, pausing just long enough to give her one last look. "You didn't just betray me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You betrayed us, everything we were." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a fresh wave of agony crashing over her. Emma sat frozen, staring at the space he had just occupied, waiting for the sound of footsteps returning, waiting for him to come back, waiting for something, anything, to prove that this wasn't the end. But it was. Hours passed, but she didn't move. The reality of what she had done settled into her bones, suffocating her under its weight. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. There was no fixing this, no undoing it, no second chances. The house felt colder, emptier than it ever had before. She was alone now, and she had no one to blame but herself.